From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus, and our discussion this week will be about Turkey. And this is as a run-up to our annual Turkey conference that we hold at MEI every year. Our conference this year will be on Monday, December 4 at Middle East Institute headquarters in Washington, D.C. You can sign up to the conference on our website, mei.edu. With me to discuss many things Turkish, both domestic and foreign, is Mr. Nicholas Danforth. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Nick is a senior analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center. There is still such a thing in the United States of America?
We try.
Right,
we try.
Specializes in Turkey and the Middle East and NATO history, as you mentioned before we started, so that's good. With us as well, our colleague, Dr. Gonul Tol, who directs our Turkey program. Gonul, welcome.
Thank you, Paul.
Gonul, why don't you take us a little bit through the sort of the panel topics of the conference before we get into the discussion?
Sure. I just first want to correct one thing. The event will be held at the National Press Club, not at the Middle East Institute. So it's an all-day event. We have 3 panels. One panel, we start with the domestic panel, and we have scholars who will be talking about Islam's relationship with the state under the AKP and the state of the opposition. We have a speaker who is the representative of the Kurdish opposition party. And we also have a panel on Turkish economy.
Well, before that, on the domestic politics, was it easy to get people to participate in this conference on opposition, people from the opposition and so on, given the situation in Turkey?
Not at all. And I've been doing this for 8 years, and this year has been particularly challenging. So in an effort to provide a balanced platform, we reach out to the opposition as well as the ruling AKP.
And which oppositions did you reach out to?
There are 4 parties in the parliament, 3 opposition parties, the pro-Kurdish party, and they will be represented here. And the CHP main opposition, we have a member of parliament from them, but it wasn't easy. And the MHP, they declined. But particularly interesting was the ruling party. We reached out to at least 7 members of parliament. They all said they didn't want to be part of this. And we reached out to people who are close to the AKP, journalists, think tankers, and they all said they didn't want to speak on the record.
Yeah,
and they
difficult
and
they
also said that given the anti-Americanism, they didn't want to be bashing Turkey or criticizing the country in Washington. So that was the response that we received.
And the other 2, it's a 3-panel conference. The second panel is on the economy. And the third?
And the third panel is on foreign policy. We'll mostly be talking about Turkey's relations with the U.S. We have the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus, Jonathan Cohen. And we have Kati Piri, member of the European Parliament. She'll be speaking on Turkey-EU relations. And we have a member of parliament from the opposition who will give us the perspective of the opposition on Turkey's foreign policy.
So we encourage listeners to sign up and see us at the National Press Club. Thank you for correcting me. Nick, President Trump talked to President Erdogan just a few days ago. Tell me a bit about that. What came out? What's different about that call?
Well, the surprising thing about that call was less what actually came out of it than how the news came out. And this shortly after the call, it was actually the Turkish foreign minister who announced that in conversation, President Trump had not only promised to stop sending U.S. arms to Syrian Kurdish fighters who we've been working with to fight ISIS, but also, according to the Turkish foreign minister, Trump added that this sending weapons to them had been some nonsense that should have been stopped long ago. Now, in a sense, this wasn't actually that surprising, given that the United States has always maintained our relationship with the Syrian Kurds has been a tactical one, has been aimed at fighting ISIS. And the United States has promised not only that when ISIS was defeated, we'd stop sending arms to the Kurds, but even promised to get back the arms that we'd already sent them.
Yeah, that had come out before. Yeah.
Right.
But am I correct, Gonul, that Department of Defense then sort of not corrected, but maybe adjusted that?
Yes, adjusted that, saying that we'll keep working with the YPG. And I agree with you. I mean, Nick,
so what the heck is going on?
Yes,
well, that's the question, right?
That's the question. We don't know. And the bigger problem here is, you're right. I mean, they keep saying, the State Department people, they keep saying that this is a transactional relationship that we have with the YPG. But on the other hand, I think it would be surprising to hear from Trump that they will cut off aid to the YPG if we take into consideration what Tillerson and Mattis said about what the U.S. wants to do in Syria.
Well, what do they want to do in Syria?
Well, they mentioned that their priority is, of course, defeating ISIS, but also they want a presence in the country once the ISIS is defeated so that it doesn't re-emerge. And they also want to contain Iranian influence. And for all those aims, I think they need to work with the Kurds.
So they would need to continue that.
Yes.
Well, and I might say, sorry.
Go ahead, but...
No, I mean, at the risk of trying too hard to parse various administration statements, it does seem like... Well, so that what Trump specifically said is that we'd cut off arms supplies to the YPG.
Yes.
Now, perhaps anticipating this, I think the YPG was actually very clever about trying to get as much arms as they could up front before the attack on Raqqa.
Yeah, they don't need a continuous stream of,
yes.
of
Right, and so I'd almost say exactly what's more important now isn't the supply of further arms, but the amount of other forms of diplomatic and military support the United States gives the YPG, exactly as you said, in an effort to push back against Iran and the Syrian regime.
But in a way, I mean, what came out from that phone call pleased the Turkish,
Very much so.
Now they're confused by what happened after, but it's certainly a positive development from the Turkish point of view. Take us a little bit through the map in northern Syria as to where Turkey is now, vis-a-vis the Kurdish issue and Idlib, the province of Idlib. Gonul, you want to go first?
Yes, sure. I mean, Turkey deployed forces on the Afrin line. And in terms of what Turkey is doing in Idlib, I don't think very few people have an idea about that.
Yeah.
Because
didn't there, people they backed moved into northern Idlib? And that's sort of where we are.
Yes, exactly. And the Turkish government has been working with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So that's a big question mark in the minds of many, because the U.S. hasn't uttered a word about that. But yeah, what Turkey doing in Idlib isn't that clear. But one thing is clear, they are there mainly to contain the Kurds. That's what they're doing. But in terms of what comes next, in terms of saving Idlib, we have no idea.
That's not clear. Nick, could you, a couple words, I mean, there was the Kurdish referendum in northern Iraq, and that's behind us now, sort of. What's the current sort of Turkish attitude towards Erbil, towards the Kurdish capital in northern Iraq?
And this is what makes Turkish strategy in northern Syria and in the region and with Turkey's domestic Kurdish conflict so complicated to figure out, is that it really seems like they've gotten themselves to a point where there's no longer any coherent strategy. They've found themselves in opposition to pretty much all Kurdish actors in the region, even those like Barzani in Kurdistan regional government in northern Iraq that they used to actually be on fairly good terms with.
Certainly, yeah.
So now not only, I mean, as Gonul mentioned, the Kurdish opposition within Turkey is jailed. They continuously threaten to expand their operations in northern Syria to actually go to war against Kurdish forces there, to invade territories like Afrin. And at the same time, the only Kurdish group that they were actually on good terms with, Barzani in Iraq, they've now, as a result of this referendum, had something of a falling out with. So it's really difficult to figure out how a coherent strategy is going to emerge from this.
How they're going to pick up the pieces.
Exactly.
Let me go back a bit to the Turkish-U.S. relationship. Kurdish issue was a big part of it. The Gulen issue was part of it. And this case in New York of a certain Mr. Zarab seems to be maybe one of the most critical. What is this case, Gonul? How would you introduce it to our listeners? And why is it important?
Well, Reza Zarrab is a Turkish-Iranian gold trader, and now he's standing before a court in New York. He's accused of evading sanctions on Iran. And what makes this very important for the Turkish government is he was involved with the Erdogan's close circle, and the ministers from his AKP cabinet was part of that. There was a case in 2013, a corruption case that also involved Reza Zarrab. So this Iranian guy, he was jailed in Turkey in 2013, but the government basically said that this was a plot against the AKP. It was part of a Gülenist effort.
But he's now in custody in New York, being tried in New York.
Yes.
And it's linked to President Erdogan's cabinet members or
yes,
family members?
Both.
And family members.
Yes.
Nick, are there links to other ruling family members in the U.S.? I mean, there was the Michael Flynn connection. And
Right.
What's the U.S. angle to all of this?
Yeah, there are a lot of U.S. angles to this, which is what makes it interesting.
Maybe it's the next Netflix TV series. Yes.
Right. No, exactly. I mean, Turkish politics have become a matter of U.S. domestic politics now in a way that, I hate to say is probably not going to be good for Turkey in the long term. There's the story of Michael Flynn being investigated for his role, initially unacknowledged, as a Turkish government lobbyist. One of the things he may well have been lobbying for was to try to make the Sarab case go away. We know for a fact that the Turkish government tried to get the Obama administration to make the case go away and even fire Preet Bharara, who was the DA working on this.
And President Trump fired him.
Ultimately fired him. So that has certainly raised questions. Nothing's known for sure now, but that could be explosive if more came out about this. And at the same time, Rudy Giuliani was also hired to search for, I think the phrase
Rudy Giuliani was hired.
Rudy Giuliani was hired to search for a diplomatic solution, which would involve Zarab going free. So certainly,
and what is the timetable of this case? Is it coming to fruition, or is it one of those long things?
No, Erdogan, apparently, the American officials have been after Reza Zarrab since 2012. So there's been an ongoing investigation, but he got caught in Florida.
He was
just
on vacation
a year ago. He was on vacation with his family.
Disney World is a very dangerous
place. Could be. And of course, many people in Turkey are not convinced that this was just a coincidence, that he had no idea.
So this could impact Erdogan and it could impact Michael Flynn and hence the administration. Because the third issue that U.S. Turkey have been fighting about is Fethullah Gulen, who's in the U.S., and it came out that Michael Flynn wanted to kidnap him or something. He was involved in that as well. What do you know about the Flynn connection there?
Well, and this all comes together. I mean, all the topics we've been talking about, the Gulen extradition, the trial of Reza Zarrab, U.S. support for the Syrian Kurds. The Turkish government's been very eager to weave all of this into a narrative, one which I think it's worth noting they probably believe, of consistent hostility from the United States, a sinister conspiracy to undermine not just Erdogan himself, but Turkey. So the fact that it was initially Gulenist prosecutors that brought the corruption case against Erdogan that originally netted Sarab in Turkey, this has been used by the Turkish government to claim that the United States is now prosecuting Zarrab at the behest of Gulen.
Mm-hmm. Wow, so like a grand conspiracy
a grand conspiracy.
Even the former DA, Preet Bharara, is accused of being a Gulenist.
Oh, dear.
Right, right.
So certainly a Netflix drama.
Indeed. Well, let me move on from U.S.-Turkish relations to the domestic situation in Turkey, which is the topic of the first panel of the conference on Monday. I mean, where is Erdogan today? Is it after several, is it now a year since the coup or a year and more? Where does he stand? Where does Turkey stand in its domestic politics? How would you describe it, and what's coming next? I know the next election is, I think, 2019.
Yes.
What's coming up in 2018? Let's put it that way.
Well, I think this might sound ironic, but I think Erdogan is vulnerable. Many people think that he's stronger after the referendum, but that was a major
razor-sharp victory.
Exactly. Yeah. And now he feels very vulnerable because he knows that under the parliamentary system, under the old system, his party could have captured 30-35% and would still be the main party in the parliament. Exactly. Yeah. And now he has to capture 50% plus one. And that's a major challenge. Given, if you look at the referendum results, he really lost ground among his own constituency, especially the urban, educated people. So that's what he's worried about. And that vulnerability, I think, makes him more aggressive.
Well, Nick, a lot of the AKP and Erdogan's success was because of Turkey's economic success and progress and job creation and so on. And the second panel on the conference on Monday is on the economy. I know you're not an economist, but how is the economy doing, or how do people feel it's doing? And how might that impact politics?
People have been predicting a potential economic crisis in Turkey for a long time. As you said, I'm not an economist. So far, Turkey has escaped all these dire predictions. And yet, the more times they're made, the more likely it seems that something bad is eventually going to happen. And when it does, I know there have been some people who are optimistic that, well, since Erdogan's success was based on the economy, if the economy collapses, this will undermine his popularity. My fear would be that at this stage, Erdogan's committed to staying in power through any means necessary. And
with the new constitution, he could stay till 2029, is it? What's the date that...
Yeah.
He could stay as long as he wants. Because after 2019, if he wins the elections in 2019, there will be nothing to stop him.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why many people
But the good Lord.
Yes. And many people in Turkey gave up hope on him too. So,
and it's worth saying we've gotten to a point where, in response to recent corruption allegations leveled against Erdogan by the main opposition party, Erdogan's accused the country's main opposition leader of treason. I believe they just opened a case against him in connection with his comments earlier today. It's gotten to the point where, already one opposition party has been criminalized and jailed. The more, as you said, I think Erdogan is a lot weaker than he looks from the outside, but how he deals with that weakness could be dangerous. And if he deals with it by, arresting more people, shutting down what newspapers are left in the country.
Well, how would you describe the political system? It's not exactly a democracy anymore, yet it's an electoral. How would you describe it today? Turkey used to be sort of the shining example of...
a few years ago, people described it as an illiberal democracy. Mm-hmm. But in an illiberal democracy, institutions and elections, they still matter. But in Turkey, that's not the case anymore. So I think it's become a textbook authoritarian country.
But I think you just said previously that elections matter, that he needs a certain number. Maybe the press is no longer free, opposition members are accused of treason, are in jail, but you still have to hold and win an election. And they still seem to be real elections. Correct me if I'm wrong.
After the referendum, of course, there were doubts about that. There were many problems in the past with Turkish democracy, but one thing was working, and that was elections. But I think that the perception has changed after the referendum. So now people think that if necessary, he can rig the elections. But it has to be the margin has to be really narrow. So if there's...
Close enough to rig.
Exactly.
Right. There's like a 3 to 5% riggable margin.
Yes, if it's more than that, he cannot. So yes, maybe Turkish democracy in a way still has a pulse, but there are a lot of things to worry about.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're running out of time. I want to end with a question, same question for both of you. If you look sort of 2-3 years ahead, what's your rosy scenario for Turkish evolution that's realistic and a dire scenario? Nick, go first.
No, sadly, it's gotten to the point where I think the rosy scenario is stable authoritarianism and the frightening scenario is chaos.
What would chaos look like? What kind of chaos?
If we were talking about, if nothing else, they've maintained a veneer of democracy and democratic legitimacy. And if that disappears, if you have an election that's stolen in 2019, that's blatantly stolen, if you have massive street protests that are, met with heavy-handed violence, if you have, you have a proliferation of armed actors in Turkey after the coup, it's sort of not just the military anymore. You have civil society groups being armed. You have
the Kurdish issue always.
Exactly, and then you have a low-level civil war, which if the PKK starts launching major terrorist attacks in Western Turkish cities again, that could take on a terrifying new dimension. So.
Hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Gonul, rosy and dire.
My rosy scenario is where in 2019 Erdogan wins the elections and he doesn't need that nationalist coalition anymore. So he thinks that the status quo with the Kurds is not sustainable and goes back to the negotiations with the Kurds.
Point. Oh, that's a good... she's more optimistic than you are, Nick.
No, but the dire scenario is I don't expect a civil war because people are really tired and they don't believe in change. So I don't expect street protests. So if he wins and if he still feels vulnerable, I think more and more people will be leaving Turkey.
So your rosy scenario is rosier, particularly on the Kurdish issue, and the dire is not as dire, but more sort of gray kind of situation. Well, there's much more to talk about, and we will be talking about it on Monday during the conference at the National Press Club. I want to thank our two guests. Nick,
thank you.
Thanks for joining us on our podcast. Gonul, thank you for being with us today. And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. And if you can't come to the conference Monday, you can hear it as a podcast or see it on our website as a video. And you can always join our conversation on this podcast at our Facebook page, facebook.com/Middle East Institute. and see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.